The president igniting another war of words with a member of the U.S. military, this time retired Admiral William McRaven, the commander who oversaw the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. President Trump not only dismisses McRaven as a, quote, Hillary Clinton backer, but says it would have been nice if bin Laden had been taken out sooner. Here's the president talking to Fox News anchor Chris Wallace.
Retired Admiral, Navy SEAL, 37 years, former head of U.S. Special Operations.
Hillary Clinton fan.
Special Operations.
Excuse me, Hillary Clinton fan.
Who led the operations, commanded the operations that took down Saddam Hussein and that killed Osama bin Laden, says that your sentiment is the greatest threat to democracy in his lifetime.
He's a Hillary Clinton backer and an Obama backer. And frankly,
he was a Navy SEAL.
Wouldn't it have been nice if we got Osama bin Laden a lot sooner than that?
McRaven has been an outspoken critic of Trump. He wrote a stunning rebuke in August, saying Trump had embarrassed and humiliated the U.S. And back in February of last year, he called Trump's attacks against the media, quote, the greatest threat to democracy.
Hey guys, John here, Admiral William McRaven, who planned the Osama bin Laden raid and spent decades leading America's most elite forces, has called Trump the greatest threat to American democracy in his lifetime. His judgment cuts through political spin with the weight of someone who has defended those institutions firsthand. The retired admirals and generals who are now speaking out against Trump are not doing so lightly. These are people who spent decades upholding a sacred tradition of military apoliticism. They understood that the armed forces must remain above the partisan fray, that the country depends on a military that serves the Constitution rather than any particular politician or party. But they have concluded, independently and unanimously, that the threat Trump poses to the nation is so severe.
McRaven is now responding to the president's latest comments. He tells CNN, quote, I did not back Hillary Clinton or anyone else. I am a fan of President Obama and President George W. Bush, both of whom I worked for. I admire all presidents, regardless of their political party, who uphold the dignity of the office and who use that office to bring the nation together in challenging times. I stand by my comment that the president's attack on the media is the greatest threat to our democracy in my lifetime. When you undermine the people's right to a free press and freedom of speech and expression, then you threaten the Constitution and all for which it stands. CNN's Boris Sanchez is at the White House for us tonight. Boris, defenders are going to say the president is simply hitting back, but this isn't the first time the president has had a controversy with a military member.
That's right, Anna. The president consistently fighting back on any criticism, whether coming from a member of the military or even military families. It's something that his supporters enjoy thoroughly, that the president fights back whenever he feels he's been attacked, though it's led to a number of awkward moments with military members and their families. Here's this list.
That staying silent would be a dereliction of the duty they still feel to the country they served. And that conclusion is absolutely devastating to Trump, because his base cannot simply dismiss these warnings as partisan attacks. They cannot wave them away as fake news or establishment conspiracy. When a four-star admiral who commanded every special operations unit in the American military, the SEALs, Delta Force, the Rangers, every single elite fighting force, tells you that Trump's attacks on the press represent an existential threat to democracy, you listen. When a retired Rear Admiral holds a formal press conference to warn that Trump's access to nuclear codes terrifies people who understand the chain of command.
You'll recall back in 2016, the president drew criticism, or I should say 2015, he drew criticism when he said that Senator John McCain wasn't a war hero because he was trapped by the Vietnamese. Then you'll recall that in 2016, during the presidential campaign, he attacked the Khan family, that Gold Star family, which spoke out at the Democratic National Convention. He also had a spat with a Gold Star family as president, the family of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, who disputed some of what President Trump said that he talked about with Johnson's widow in a phone call. We should also point out President Trump has never actually visited troops in war zones, something that he was criticized for this week. He's promised he will do that, but it is notable that the president hasn't done so yet. It's considered one of the basic requirements for being commander-in-chief. And this week, the president also drew criticism because he didn't visit Arlington National Cemetery on Veterans Day. The president told Fox News that is something he regrets. Listen to this.
I should have done that. I was extremely busy on calls for the country. We did a lot of calling, as you know. I think.
But this is Veterans Day.
I probably.
You pay attention. When former NATO commanders warned that Trump's misunderstanding of Article 5 could trigger catastrophic consequences for global security, you cannot simply change the channel. This is the nightmare scenario for Trump's political operation. They have developed sophisticated defenses against every kind of criticism. They know how to handle democratic attacks, how to spin congressional investigations, how to dismiss media coverage as biased. But they have no effective response to decorated military officers speaking from a position of unimpeachable credibility about specific national security concerns that go to the very heart of Trump's fitness for office. They cannot call these men partisans because their careers and records prove otherwise.
You know, in retrospect, I should have, and I did last year, and I will virtually every year. But we had come in very late at night, and I had just left literally the American Cemetery in Paris, and I really probably assumed that was fine. And I was extremely busy because of affairs of state, doing other things.
Now, Anna, defenders of the president will say that few presidents have done more to supply arms and to support members of the armed services, whether they are in war zones or on their way back. Anna?
All right, Boris Sanchez at the White House. Thanks. I want to open up this discussion, and with us, CNN political analyst David Drucker. He's also senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. CNN military and diplomatic analyst, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby, and CNN military analyst, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Admiral, I'll start with you because you were at the Pentagon when bin Laden was captured. What do you make of the president's remark?
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that. I mean, look, there was a lot of planning and effort that went into getting bin Laden. And of course, that mission was anything but easy. It was very, very risky. And
They cannot dismiss their warnings as ignorance because these are the people who know more about national security than almost anyone alive. They cannot attack their motives because these admirals have nothing to gain and everything to lose by breaking the norms of military silence. All Trump can do is lash out personally, attacking the messenger in ways that only make him look more defensive and more vulnerable. And that is exactly what we have seen. When McRaven spoke out about the threat to democracy, Trump did not respond with a substantive defense of his record. He did not explain why his attacks on the press were justified. He did not offer a coherent argument about why the free press should be delegitimized.
actually lost a helicopter in the midst of it. I mean, it was very dangerous, but it's not like we ever took our eyes off of bin Laden or weren't trying to get him since 9/11. I mean, he was just very evasive and was able to elude capture or killing. But there was a lot of effort that went into that. So I was a little bit alarmed by that. It doesn't comport with my sense of the history of how hard it was and how long the effort was to get bin Laden.
Colonel, in the aftermath of 9/11, I know you collected intel on bin Laden. When the president says he should have been caught sooner, do you take that personally?
In a way, I do, because one of the big things, Anna, that happened was that the main source that we had about bin Laden's whereabouts was compromised, and it was compromised in several outlets to include the president's favorite news network, Fox News. So you have a situation where the information that we were dealing with was very perishable. The types of things that we did required bin Laden to be in certain places in order for us to go after him. We could have potentially gotten him as early as 2001, but because the intelligence that we had was so perishable, we lost him, and it took until 2011 before we actually got him.
Instead, he went on Fox News and personally attacked McRaven's record, questioning why it took so long to find bin Laden, suggesting the raid should have happened sooner. He disparaged one of the most successful counterterrorism operations in American history because the man who oversaw it had criticized him. The response was so transparently defensive, so obviously driven by personal pique rather than substantive disagreement, that it produced bipartisan outrage. Even Republicans who normally defended Trump against all criticism found themselves unable to justify attacking a decorated commander over the bin Laden raid. Trump's response to McRaven revealed more about his fear than any political analysis could. He was genuinely rattled, genuinely uncertain how to counter criticism from someone with McRaven's credentials, and his instinctive resort to personal attack only made the criticism more powerful. The McRaven episode set the template for every subsequent confrontation between Trump and the military leaders who have spoken out against him. The pattern is always the same. A decorated commander issues a specific and professionally grounded warning about Trump's fitness or decision-making. Trump responds with a personal attack that avoids the substance of the criticism. The attack backfires, generating more attention for the original warning and making Trump look petty and defensive. And the original warning gains credibility from Trump's inability to engage with it substantively. This pattern has repeated itself with every admiral and general who has broken the norm of military silence to warn about Trump. And each repetition has made the warnings more powerful and more difficult for Trump supporters to dismiss. What makes this moment particularly significant is the scale and scope of the military leadership speaking out against Trump. We are not talking about one disgruntled retired officer with a personal grievance. We are talking about a pattern involving some of the most senior and respected commanders of their generation. These are people who have operated at the highest levels of American military and national security power, who have held the nuclear chain of command in their hands, who have advised presidents and shaped foreign policy. Their collective judgment about Trump is consistent and deeply alarming. They are not saying he has bad policies or that they disagree with his priorities. They are saying that his behavior, his instincts, his relationship with information and advice, his attitude toward institutional processes, all of it represents a danger to the nation that is qualitatively different from anything they have seen in their long careers. The specific warnings they are issuing cover three distinct but interconnected areas of concern. First, there is the threat to democratic institutions, particularly the free press, which McRaven identified as the greatest threat to democracy in his lifetime. Second, there is the nuclear chain of command, which Rear Admiral Michael Smith warned about in the starkest possible terms. Third, there is the NATO alliance and America's treaty commitments, which former NATO commanders have raised as an urgent concern. Each of these warnings carries the weight of professional expertise and first-hand observation. These commanders are not speculating about what Trump might do. They are describing what they saw when they operated inside the White House, when they watched Trump make decisions, when they observed how he responded to information he did not want to hear. They are drawing on specific experience and specific knowledge to issue warnings that no one else is qualified to make. The catastrophic White House secrets that these admirals are revealing are not classified documents or leaked intelligence reports. They are something more fundamental and, in some ways, more disturbing. They are first-hand assessments from people who have operated at the highest levels of American military and national security power, of what it looked like when someone with Trump's instincts, his attitude toward institutional processes, his relationship with information, and with advice he disagreed with, was in charge of decisions that could affect the survival of millions of people. When an admiral who has spent his career inside the nuclear chain of command says the prospect of Trump having access to those codes again terrifies him, that is a catastrophic secret, not a classified document. A professional verdict on fitness and judgment from someone who has seen both up close and concluded they do not belong in the same room together. Let us start with Admiral William McRaven, because his intervention was the first major public break by a commander of his specific seniority and operational standing with Trump. And because the way the confrontation played out set the template for every similar confrontation that followed. Understanding the McRaven episode in full detail is important because it reveals both the nature of the military concerns about Trump and the pattern of Trump's response to those concerns that has defined every subsequent exchange between him and the commanders who have spoken out. McRaven is not a political figure in any conventional sense. He spent decades in special operations, eventually rising to command all of United States Special Operations Command. That meant he was responsible for every elite unit in the American military, operating across every theater, carrying out the most sensitive and consequential missions the country undertakes. He oversaw Operation Neptune Spear, the raid on Abbottabad that resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden. He is by any measure one of the most operationally accomplished military officers of his generation, and he wrote a piece in which he called Trump's sustained attack on the free press the greatest threat to democracy in his lifetime. That is a strong and specific statement. He is not saying Trump's policies are misguided or that he disagrees with his priorities. He is saying that a specific behavior, the systematic delegitimization of the free press, represents the greatest threat to American democracy that a man who has spent his life defending that democracy has ever seen. Trump's response to that statement tells you a great deal about how seriously and how personally the White House took it, and about what kind of criticism actually penetrates the political armor that Trump has built around himself. Instead of ignoring it, instead of dismissing it as partisan noise from someone who just did not like him, instead of having a surrogate handle it with standard political deflection, Trump went on Fox News and personally attacked McRaven. He questioned why it took so long to find bin Laden, suggesting the raid should have happened sooner. He essentially disparaged one of the most successful and celebrated counterterrorism operations in American history because the man who oversaw it had criticized him. That response produced bipartisan outrage, because attacking a decorated commander over the one mission that America has been most united on for years, using the political attack as a deflection from the substance of what was being said, that is not the response of a confident leader. That is the response of someone who knows he cannot answer the substance and is hoping that attacking the messenger will change the subject. It did not. Now let us talk about Rear Admiral Michael Smith and what he did, because his intervention was in some ways even more remarkable than McRaven's in terms of the specific constitutional and security claims he made in the specific context in which he chose to make them. A press conference at a state capitol on camera with his name and rank and service record attached to every word. That is not a retired officer venting to a journalist off the record or writing a carefully worded op-ed with hedged language. That is a formal public statement from a person with specific professional credentials, making specific and attributable claims about a specific individual's fitness to hold the most powerful office in the world. And the specific things he said are worth examining carefully because they reveal the precise nature of the catastrophic White House concerns that military commanders are trying to communicate to the public in the clearest and most responsible language they have available. Smith stood up at a press conference at the Wisconsin State Capitol and said things that retired admirals simply do not say. He said, Trump represents an existential threat to the United States. He said Trump must never again be allowed in the Oval Office. And he explained why he was breaking the unwritten rule that says retired military officers do not engage in partisan politics, a rule that exists specifically to protect the perception of a neutral, apolitical military that serves the country regardless of which party is in power. Smith said he was breaking that rule because the threat posed by Trump was so unique, so specifically dangerous to the Constitution and to the nuclear chain of command that staying silent was no longer a morally acceptable option for someone with his knowledge and his background. Think about that for a moment. A man who has spent his career operating within a set of professional norms that he clearly takes seriously, a man who understands better than most what the political neutrality of the military means and why it matters, concluded that the threat was severe enough to override those norms. That is not a partisan decision. That is a professional judgment that the normal rules of engagement for retired officers are insufficient to address the specific danger being posed. And the specific danger he named, the nuclear chain of command, is not an abstraction. It is the specific set of processes, authorities, and decision-making structures through which the President of the United States can authorize the use of nuclear weapons. When a Rear Admiral says Trump's relationship to that chain of command terrifies him, he is describing something specific and technical and deeply serious that most of the people watching political coverage do not have the background to fully appreciate. He is saying that the way Trump operates, the instincts, the information processing, the attitude toward institutional advice and toward the experts who provide it, is incompatible with the careful, process-driven decision-making that nuclear authority requires. That is not a political opinion. That is an expert assessment of a specific competency gap with potentially catastrophic consequences. Then there is the NATO dimension, which adds another layer to the catastrophic secrets being revealed by former commanders. Former Admiral James Stavridis and other senior officers have raised consistent concerns about Trump's understanding of NATO's Article 5, the collective defense commitment that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all of them. This is not a bureaucratic technicality. Article 5 is the foundation of the entire post-World War II European security architecture. It is the commitment that has deterred Russian aggression, stabilized Central European democracies, and kept American troops from having to fight another major land war in Europe for 80 years. Trump's publicly stated skepticism about Article 5, his suggestions that the United States might not defend NATO allies who do not meet defense spending targets, his framing of the alliance as a financial transaction rather than a security commitment. All of this is something that former military commanders who actually understand what Article 5 means in practice find genuinely alarming. The value of a collective defense commitment lies entirely in its credibility. An ally that might or might not honor its treaty obligations, depending on whether it feels adequately compensated, is not an ally that deters aggression. It is an ally that invites it. And the former commanders who are speaking out about Trump's NATO posture are saying with the specific authority of people who have spent careers inside that alliance that his instincts on collective defense could lead to catastrophic miscalculations by adversaries who conclude that the American commitment is negotiable. That is not a foreign policy disagreement. That is a warning from people who have run the military that the way Trump thinks about alliances creates specific and identifiable risks of the kind of large-scale conflict that Article 5 exists to prevent. Here is what connects all of these individual military voices into a single coherent and alarming picture that is greater than the sum of its individual parts. The common thread running through McRaven's warning about democracy, Smith's warning about nuclear codes and the chain of command, and Stavridis' warning about NATO collective defense is not partisan opposition to Trump's specific policies or partisan alignment with his political opponents. None of these officers have positioned themselves as democratic advocates or as political actors in any conventional sense. The common thread is something more fundamental and more professionally grounded than that. It is a professional assessment of decision-making processes, institutional norms, and the relationship between a commander-in-chief and the structures of national security. Every one of these officers spent their careers operating within institutional frameworks, chains of command, intelligence processes, alliance commitments that exist specifically because individual human judgment, however experienced or well-intentioned, is not sufficient to manage the consequences of the decisions being made at the level of nuclear weapons and major alliances. Those frameworks are the product of decades of hard lessons about what goes wrong when they are bypassed or ignored. And what these admirals are describing when they talk about Trump's White House is a leader who consistently treated those institutional frameworks as obstacles rather than safeguards, whose attitude toward advice he did not want to hear was dismissal rather than engagement, and whose decision-making about the most consequential matters of national security was shaped by political and personal instincts rather than the careful process-driven analysis that the stakes require. That is the catastrophic White House secret, not a specific classified document. The pattern of how decisions were being made, and by implication, how they would be made again if Trump returns to full, unimpeded executive power. The military's apolitical tradition, the norm that says retired officers do not engage in partisan politics, exists for a specific and important reason. It exists to protect the perception that the United States military serves the country and the Constitution rather than any political party or individual leader. When retired officers break that tradition, they are making an implicit statement that the threat they are warning about is more serious than the value of maintaining the tradition. They are saying the normal rules of professional conduct are insufficient to address the specific danger being posed. That is a high threshold. And the fact that multiple senior commanders, people who understand that tradition and what it protects, have independently concluded that threshold has been crossed, tells you something important about the nature of the warnings they are making. These are not people who break institutional norms lightly. They are people who have spent careers operating within institutional norms and who understand better than most what is lost when those norms are violated. The fact that they are violating this specific norm is itself part of the message. And the message they are delivering about democracy, about nuclear codes, about NATO and collective defense, is one that reaches exactly the voters who are most resistant to partisan political messaging. Veterans, people who trust the uniform, moderates who discount political attacks but pay attention when decorated commanders speak. That is who these warnings are reaching. And the Trump campaign's inability to dismiss them with usual partisan framing is why the personal attacks, like going after McRaven over bin Laden, have been so transparently defensive rather than effective. The difference between a political opinion and a professional assessment matters enormously here, because it determines how the warning should be weighted and what it actually tells us about the specific risks being described. The nuclear chain of command in the United States is one of the most carefully designed and rigorously maintained institutional structures in human history. It exists specifically to ensure that the decision to use nuclear weapons, the most consequential single decision any human being can make, is made through a deliberate, informed, process-driven chain of authorization that includes multiple safeguards against impulsive, uninformed, or politically motivated action. Every element of that structure was designed with the understanding that the person at the top of it would be under enormous pressure, operating with incomplete information, advised by people with competing interests, and potentially making decisions in conditions of extreme stress. The safeguards exist because the designers of that structure understood that individual human judgment is not sufficient at that level of consequence. When Smith says Trump's relationship to that structure terrifies him, he is not saying Trump is stupid or that he does not care about consequences. He is saying something more specific and more technically grounded. He is saying that the way Trump processes institutional advice, the way he responds to information he does not want to hear, and the way he makes decisions in high-pressure situations is incompatible with the careful, process-dependent decision-making that the nuclear chain of command requires. That is an expert assessment of a specific competency issue with consequences that no political analysis can fully capture, and it deserves to be taken seriously on those terms. The tradition of military apoliticism is not just a professional norm, it is a structural safeguard. It exists because a military that involves itself in politics becomes a tool of political power rather than an instrument of national security. When retired commanders break that tradition to warn about a specific leader, they are making a statement not just about that leader, but about the state of the institutions that are supposed to constrain executive power when it operates outside appropriate boundaries. The fact that multiple decorated commanders independently across different time periods, in different formats, from different service backgrounds, have each concluded that the threat posed by Trump to democratic institutions, to nuclear decision-making processes, and to the credibility of America's alliance commitments is severe enough to override a professional tradition they clearly value and understand. Tells you something important and specific about the condition of those institutions and those processes during his tenure. Not what politicians say about them, what the people who operated inside them at the highest levels concluded when they looked directly at what they saw. It tells you that the people closest to those institutions, the people who understand their mechanics and their importance most thoroughly, saw something that alarmed them enough to take the extraordinary step of speaking publicly about it in defiance of a professional norm they clearly value. Watch how the current senior military leadership, the active duty commanders serving under Trump right now, navigate the tension between professional loyalty to their commander-in-chief and the institutional norms and legal obligations that the retired commanders who are speaking out are bending. Watch for any additional statements or appearances from retired senior officers as Trump's second term produces new decisions on Iran, on NATO, and on nuclear posture. Because each new development gives the commanders who have already spoken a new opportunity to update their public assessment with current examples. And watch how Trump himself responds to continued criticism from military figures. Because his response pattern, which has consistently been to attack the messenger personally rather than engage the substance of what is being said, reveals more about the underlying accuracy of the military assessments than any political defense of his record could. The admirals are talking, the warnings are specific, and the credentials behind them are the kind that voters who have been skeptical of political criticism find compelling in ways that nothing else in the public debate around Trump has managed to match. The fact that multiple senior commanders have independently concluded that the threat posed by Trump is severe enough to break a professional tradition they clearly value tells you something important and specific about the condition of those institutions, those processes during his tenure. Not what politicians say about them, what the people who operated inside them at the highest levels concluded when they looked directly at what they saw. So here's the honest, big picture read on what the military leadership interventions reveal and why they matter beyond the immediate political moment. The catastrophic warnings from McRaven, Smith, Stavridis, and the broader pattern of senior commanders who have spoken out are not partisan attacks dressed in military clothing. They are professional assessments from people whose entire careers were built on making accurate judgments about capability, risk, and the competence of the people in their chain of command. Their judgment about Trump is uniform, consistent, and deeply alarming. They are saying that Trump's behavior, his instincts, his relationship with information and advice, his attitude toward institutional processes, all of it represents a danger to the nation that is qualitatively different from anything they have seen in their long careers. These admirals are not speculating. They are describing what they saw when they operated inside the White House, when they watched Trump make decisions, when they observed how he responded to information he did not want to hear. They are drawing on specific experience and specific knowledge to issue warnings that no one else is qualified to make. And the fact that they have chosen to break with a lifetime of professional tradition to deliver those warnings should give every American pause. When the people who have spent their lives defending the country tell you that the country is in danger, you should listen. When the people who understand the nuclear chain of command better than almost anyone alive tell you that the person at the top of that chain represents a terrifying risk, you should pay attention. When the people who have commanded America's most elite fighting forces tell you that democracy itself is threatened, you should take them seriously. Military leaders are warning about Trump's national security conduct, and these revelations are far from over. The pressure will mount, and his response will reveal his vulnerability. The truth they're exposing could reshape everything we know about his presidency.